Welcome to the 4th International Apologetics Marathon here on the Trinity Channel. We're so glad that you decided to join us. The topic for today is the subject of abortion. What is it? Is it right? Is it wrong? What should God's people, what should anyone think about abortion? I'm very, very blessed today to have with me Mr. Ed Rivet, who is the Legislative Director for Michigan Right to Life. And oh, by the way, I'm Mike Buratovich. I am Professor of Biochemistry at Spring Arbor University. And today, Ed and I are going to discuss this topic of abortion. So let's just get right into it. So, Ed, from both a medical and a legal perspective, what is an abortion? What does it mean?
Well, what it means is when you have a pregnancy that is intentionally terminated early, with the intent of causing the death of the child. That's what's important, because there are times when a pregnancy ends early, it's a miscarriage or a stillbirth, and that doesn't imply anything from an ethical standpoint, from a legal standpoint. So what we really talk about when we debate about the controversy of abortion is the idea that in law we have legalized the killing of an unborn child. So it's the intentional killing of a child who's otherwise not ready to be born. And unfortunately, that can range from very early in the pregnancy to very late in the pregnancy in some countries, including the United States, where we're broadcasting from, where abortion is legal throughout the entire term of the pregnancy, which is really the intent to kill the child and then remove it from the mother's body. Again, a very important distinction between cases where a child is lost naturally through miscarriage or a stillbirth, or even instances where an activity to try and save the mother's life medically may have a detrimental effect on the child.
Now, what about someone who might say, well, look, people die because of war. People die every day because of car accidents or something like that. What makes abortion distasteful? What makes it evil? What makes it heinous, if it is any of those things?
Well, it most certainly is, because we always look at any, destruction of human life as the most significant, severe thing that can happen, because we can all relate to the importance of the sanctity of every person's life. And with the unborn child in particular, one of the most important elements in any culture is the idea of justice, and that no one's life should be taken in a manner that is unjust. I mean, we may think about whether war in defense of a country is just. We may think about capital punishment if there is a person who is a heinous criminal, whether they deserve the death penalty. But with the unborn child, they're completely innocent. There's just no basis. There's no justice in abortion. And so that's why when you have a culture that moves to the idea that we can, in the name of women's rights or in the name of advancing someone who may be otherwise in a difficult situation, that we can justify killing an unborn child who's completely innocent, runs completely askew with justice. And certainly if we put ourselves in those shoes, if I am the unborn child, there's nothing more unjust than someone else deciding that I should die for their reasons.
Now, there's an inherent presupposition that you're making, and that is that the unborn is a full bona fide member of the human community, and therefore at least deserves the right not to be harmed. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, yeah, it is, and it's been part of the debate in the United States and elsewhere for decades. And when abortion became legal in the United States and in Europe in the late 60s and into the early 70s, we didn't have the technology we have today. The ultrasound technology, where we can see the unborn child developing from the very earliest stages, our understanding of embryology and fetal development is so much more advanced. Now every child almost born in America today, their first picture in their scrapbook that they can show is an ultrasound of themselves before they were born. So the argument that it's not a human being is kind of gone by the wayside. Yes, at the very earliest stages they may not look as well developed, but within a matter of 6 weeks, the child looks like us, only less developed. Arms and legs, fingers and toes. At 6 weeks of development, the unborn child has brain waves that are measurable. They have unique fingerprints by 11 weeks. These are all things, all the organs form by 8 weeks. These are things that exist in the unborn child while they're very, very small, long before mom can feel the baby in the womb, long before anyone can see the child. All of the features that we would consider that make you and I a human being, they have as well. And from the moment of conception, once that fertilization occurs, the DNA pattern is set, whether you're male or female, how tall you're going to be, what color your eyes are going to be. All that is set by God's design in our genetics, and that happens at the very beginning. That is God's imprint on us, and that exists from the moment of conception. And so the idea that the unborn child is not fully part of the human family, you have to make up rationalizations. You have to really say things that run counter to our own intuitive nature to know, yep, that's how I started, that's how you started, we all began the same. We are all part of the human family together.
And in terms of science, when you think of, say, a crocodile, mom and dad crocodiles, they give birth to crocodiles. Sunflowers, they make sunflowers. Oaks make oaks. Non-human primates, monkeys, make monkeys. But for some reason, when it comes to the unborn human is somehow not fully human. I have to admit, I don't understand that from a scientific perspective. I really don't.
Well, one of the things we talk about frequently in the abortion debate, or as we talk about it from a legal standpoint, the debates that happen in public policy in the state capitals or Washington or elsewhere around the world, even in the United Nations building, we call it the abortion distortion. And that simply is based on the idea that you have to turn things upside down or twist them 180 degrees in the reverse direction in order for the logic to make sense. And you can't do it. So that very idea that, well, it's not fully human, it's not developed as a person yet, so therefore we can legitimize killing the unborn child in abortion, is really a distortion of logic. And as you say, you really can't make 2 and 2 add up when someone makes that sort of argument, because it just doesn't fit.
Throughout the world, is abortion commonly practiced?
Unfortunately, it is commonly practiced. It's a distinction, though, between whether that is legally sanctioned, part of the laws, it's recognized, it's been brought into the medical profession, or whether in some countries where it's not legal or less legal, you have clandestine abortions that are done, as they would say in this country, back alley abortions. They're done in secret. So those distinctions are important. What is clear is when a society legalizes abortion, it multiplies enormously because it sends a message that is legitimate. If something is legal, it's considered okay, it's considered moral, as we see in Western civilized countries like Europe and the United States. You bring it in under the auspices of doctors and clinics, then it becomes okay. It must be okay. And it divorces from the moral equation that says it's not okay. There is something inherently wrong. When we look to more traditional cultures, especially in Africa and places like that, where there's still that inherent respect for the child as an extension of the next generation. Native American tribes in America, for example, consider your child to the 7th generation is an extension of yourself. And so that inherent respect for the child and the generational connection from one generation to the next kind of pushes back against those ideas that, well, we can rationalize it, we can make it legal, and therefore we make it okay. So even though it happens everywhere in the world, there's a great distinction between societies that have embraced it, have made it legitimate, and those societies that have not done that.
Who promotes abortion, and who are the ones who are opposed to them? Or is all opposition to abortion inherently religious?
Well, it's not, and it's an important question because people don't realize that there are organizations committed to legalizing abortion around the world. You have the International Planned Parenthood Organization. You have groups like in Great Britain, the Marie Stopes Organization. They're a very large abortion provider and work to promote it in third world countries, in places like Africa and elsewhere. There are organizations that meet and promote the policies at the United Nations. They literally have councils and groups that that try and go into foreign countries where abortion's not legal and sort of browbeat the governments there to say that they're oppressing women, that they're taking away women's fundamental rights. So they couch it in those kinds of international rights treaties and things like that. So there are groups out there promoting it very directly, wanting to legalize it across the globe. In contrast, you have groups like Right to Life that I'm involved in. They are national and international groups, and certainly the churches that have a biblical basis. But opposition to abortion is not limited to just the Christian faith. Orthodox Judaism, Islam, and other faiths teach very clearly that intentionally killing an unborn child definitely is an offense against God's design for creation. It's an offense against that idea that each of our children is to be considered a blessing. Throughout human history, children were always viewed as a gift, and certainly a gift from God, and we praise God for each child. And so when a culture is pushing, or organizations have an agenda to legalize abortion, then very clearly they're running against that. There are also those who have become advocates of abortion because of their own abortion experience. And in some cases, that post-abortion experience is to rationalize or justify, I did it, I'm going to make sure others have the ability to do it. And it sort of helps them to address their own conflict, their own guilt. They made the decision. Now, if other women make the decision, it validates mine. And it helps them kind of smooth over, wash away that sense of guilt or that which might be plaguing them on their soul or in their emotion or their mental state.
You also have women who have had abortions and then have become opponents of it too, right?
Absolutely. When you ask who's opposed, some of the strongest opponents of abortion today are women who made that choice, who had an abortion, realized that it was a decision they wish they had never made. Perhaps they were threatened, perhaps they were coerced into making that decision. And so for them, they're strong advocates against it because they see the damage that happened to them or to someone they know and love. Women suffer complications and so forth from abortion. So again, as you mentioned, some of the strongest advocates against abortion are women who once had them.
Wow. For example, Abby Johnson, for example, who was head of a fairly good size abortion clinic in Texas, who's now a pro-life advocate. Or, in fact, the original plaintiff in Roe v. Wade actually became a very staunch pro-life advocate.
That is correct. Many of our strongest spokespersons in the pro-life movement in the United States today are people who were advocates or participated in abortion. We have many former abortion providers themselves, doctors, who once did abortions and they now oppose abortion. They testify before legislatures and in Congress. They produce videos explaining the truth of abortion. So again, those converts from the abortion experience are often the strongest advocates to tell you that however they sell an abortion to a woman, many times they're misleading them and glossing over the difficulties and the struggles that women will have down the road.
Wow. Let's talk a little bit about how abortions are done, the actual procedure itself. And let me warn you, if you have young children listening to us, you might want to exercise some discretion because there might be some details that may disturb them. So let's talk about if the unborn child is, say, between the ages of, say, 1 day old to, say, 9 weeks, a so-called medical abortion. What's used for a medical abortion?
Right. Well, what's commonly known now as the abortion pill, RU486, is the numerical expression when it was being developed. It was developed in France. It's very common in its usage across Europe and in all the developed countries and now around the world and in the United States. And it's really a 2-pill regimen. They give the first pill, RU486, and that breaks down the connection between the baby and the mother at the placenta level. It disrupts the hormone communication. And then after a few days, 1 to 2 days later, they give a second pill, and that pill forces contractions of the uterus. And then, so the baby is kind of cut off from the mother's nutritional supply with the first pill, and then the second pill causes contractions to expel the child.
Wow.
So that medical abortion is done in the earlier stages, and they're actually experimenting further and further into pregnancy and discovering that they can cause a later miscarriage, even beyond when the child is very small, that 7 to 9 week stage, and they're using it to induce later and later abortions all the time.
The RU486 drug, the mifepristone, as I believe it's called, is that a safe drug?
Well, it depends on your definition of safe. It is never safe for the unborn child. It kills the unborn child, so it is a deadly drug for human beings in the womb. Any other drug, if they brought it on the market and said, well, this drug has the risk of killing you 99% of the time, that drug would never, ever be approved. But a drug that was specifically designed to kill small human beings is on the market. So yes, it's dangerous, but women have a wide variety of complications, and it is frequently the combination of drugs together. The second drug, misoprostol, which causes the contractions, can often cause significant bleeding. They use different regimens that can lead to infections. So certainly there are women who have died from this drug, and what they thought was going to be take a few pills and the pregnancy goes away and the baby goes away. Instead, they've had significant problems, or they'll have significant hemorrhaging. They have to be hospitalized and have transfusions, blood transfusions. So for some women, the complications can be very severe.
Wow. What about methotrexate?
Methotrexate is a drug that they discovered. It was a cancer drug initially that they discovered does cause women to have miscarriages, stillbirths, and so forth. And that was used early on, back in the 70s and 80s. But with the development of RU486, it's much more targeted. It has fewer complications. So they've taken that one kind of out of use. And a number of other techniques, as they improve, unfortunately for me to say, improve their ability to kill an unborn child, they move toward those techniques that cause the least number of complications, which medically makes sense for the woman, but doesn't leave the procedure safe in every case. And some women, the different types of procedures are definitely contraindicated, that it would be a danger to them for various reasons.
What about aspiration abortions, or the vacuum aspiration, MVA type abortions?
Yes. Well, when you start talking the aspiration or the suction abortions, it's a similar idea. That they're going to literally suction the baby from the mother's womb. And this is the most common abortion. This is the first trimester abortion. It is done in the United States about 90% of the time. It's in that window from about 3 or 4 weeks after conception until the end of the first trimester, about 12 weeks. And so I can demonstrate for the viewers, and again, we do ask if there's some discretion here because we're going to describe abortion. So this small unborn child that I have here is at about 12 weeks of development after conception. So it only looks about as big as my thumb, all curled up. But this baby has arms and legs. This baby has all of its organs functioning. It swims around, it flips, it sucks its thumb. It's had brain waves for a number of weeks. It's got unique fingerprints already. So this is a baby that mom still can't feel flipping around inside of her tummy, but is very active, has a full neural processes going on, etc. So what happens then in a first trimester abortion is the physician will use a suction curette that looks like this. It's only 8 millimeters. Now later at this stage, they might use a tube that's a little bit bigger, so maybe the wider end of the tube rather than the narrow end at about 12 millimeters. But essentially, that baby is going to be suctioned through this tube. Now the tissue is very soft. The joints and the bones are not very firm, and so the strong suction of that machine will literally start to pull this baby apart in pieces and suction it through that tube. So it's a very gruesome way to die. It dismembers the baby in pieces, sucking it through the tube. So it's really hooked to a very strong vacuum machine. And so this is how thousands of unborn babies die in the Western world every day. In the United States, nearly 3,000 a day are suctioned to pieces in this manner. So it is gruesome, it is violent, it is not at all consistent with what medicine is about, what doctors were, what they went to medical school to learn. this is a gruesome reality. And that's how the most common abortions are done across the United States and Europe.
Can the baby feel pain at that stage?
Well, certainly you see it react to this. You mentioned Abby Johnson, and she was working in an abortion facility. The ultrasound was being used to guide the abortionist so he could see where the baby was in the womb. She was using that machine. She saw the baby react to actually touch, to push away as that tube was coming to destroy that baby's life. She saw it visibly reacting to the stimulus that this tube was coming, and it had a destructive force. And so yes, they move their arms and legs, they swim around, they suck their thumbs. So they're very much interactive, and so undoubtedly they have the neural capacity to have pain signals sent to their brain.
And no anesthesia is given for the baby?
Nothing whatsoever. The child dies a very violent death, and there's no getting around it.
Oh my goodness. Let's talk about second trimester procedures. What can you tell us about things like dilation and curettage, or dilation and evacuation, things like that?
Well, abortions only get more brutal as they go further into the pregnancy. Once we move past that first trimester, the baby's bones do begin to firm up. Their ligaments get stronger. It literally becomes difficult to tear the child from the mother's womb, and yet they still perform procedures like that. Currently, there's a debate happening in the United States about the D&E procedure. We've seen some videos about Planned Parenthood and the whole organ and tissue trafficking reality. And in that reality, the doctors, as you saw in the very first video that was released, the doctor says, well, I use these instruments and I crush here and I crush there. And literally what that means is they are dismembering the child. They are literally taking arms and legs. They're crushing the thorax, the body. They're crushing the skull and pulling out pieces one at a time. It's very brutal. There is no humaneness to this kind of abortion whatsoever. As you mentioned, they don't anesthetize the baby. They just go in and tear the child apart. It is brutal. It is violent. There is no medical justification for this kind of brutality, and yet it's happening thousands of times every day across the United States and in other countries. The D&E abortion is brutal, and there's that why you're beginning to see legislatures across this country in the United States prohibiting the procedure, attempting to. In many European countries, they limit abortions to about that 12-week stage, that baby that I showed you, because of that very reason, that abortion becomes completely inhumane. It becomes more dangerous to the mother to dilate her womb, to be able to pull the child out, puts her at greater risk. And so many European countries limit abortion so they don't move into the second trimester, because they recognize the brutality and that it simply isn't consistent with medicine whatsoever.
What is an induction abortion?
Well, induction abortions are done at the latest stage, when the baby becomes so big now, so intact, and so difficult to remove from the womb, unless you essentially induce the labor. You put the woman into an artificial birth situation and then bring the child forward. And so you're inducing a full labor in most instances. The woman most often has to be conscious and aware. She's going to have contractions. It's like she's going to deliver a child, maybe perhaps a much smaller child than a full delivery. And they often are going to give drugs that they will ensure that the baby dies first. They will even inject, they'll take a long needle, inject it through the mother's abdomen into the uterus, into that cavity, and inject drugs into either the amniotic fluid around the baby, or sometimes literally into the heart of the baby. So they're using ultrasound to guide a needle and induce a drug, inject a drug that will kill the baby, stop the baby's heart, and then induce a labor. So when you say induction, it's just like inducing labor, perhaps for a woman who's past her due date, she's going to give birth to a child. Well, they do the same sort of drug inducement for an abortion, only the intent is to kill that baby.
Wow. And then third trimester abortion techniques are probably even more gruesome, I would imagine.
Well, they're similar. At that stage, they have to induce because the baby's simply too big to come out any other way. There was practice in the United States until the Congress passed a law to make it illegal, partial birth abortions, where through that latter part of the second trimester into the third trimester, they would spend a few days with drugs and means to dilate the woman's uterus, the cervix, to open it up, pull the baby out feet first, and then because the head was too big to come forward, they would suction the child's head cavity, the brain, out with the tube to collapse it and allow the birth. This brutal partial birth abortion procedure is now banned in the United States. I don't know that it's being practiced commonly in Europe and elsewhere, but there was no limit to the brutality that was being practiced here in the United States of America. When we have everything we can offer women, we're destroying children in a very brutal and inhumane fashion.
Just your description of it sounds barbaric.
Well, and I work to pass a law here in our own state, and it's been banned by a federal law, but across the country in the United States with laws to ban it. So, yeah, it's a brutal reality, and if you discuss it and you bring it to people's awareness, they become really horrified by what abortion has become.
What are some of the risks the mother can have from abortion procedures?
Well, there's a very long list, and perhaps as we come back from a break, we can talk about that. But there are risks of infection and bleeding, hemorrhage that is dangerous. The later abortion procedures could put her at risk of an incompetent cervix. She may not be able to bear children in the future. And we can talk about the post-abortion complications and the risk, increased risk of breast cancer and other things that come into play from repeated abortions, because some women, especially in countries like the United States and in Russia, where they have many, many abortions. And so those complications can build on one another because women are having multiple abortions. Most people think it's a one-time, oh, she had this crisis situation and she's choosing in this abortion this one time. Some women can have 3, 4, 5, 7 abortions in a lifetime, and that introduces a different set of complications in her future. So there's lots. And that doesn't deal with the emotional and psychological complications, which we can talk about as well, that are...
I'm reminded of a website you may have heard of called Abortion Changes You.
I've not seen that website, one that I suppose people should take a look at.
It's how abortion affects both men and women. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we're up to a break. So we will be back with Ed Rivet here from Michigan Right to Life in just a few minutes.
And Trinity Channel invites you to watch a special live debate, Imam Ijazi Ahmed versus Dr. Tony Costa. The topic will be,
was Jesus the Son of God or only the prophet of God?
The debate will be held October 9th, 2015, 7 p.m. Eastern, 12 a.m. Greenwich, and 9 a.m. Australian. Watch us live on ABN and Trinity Channel, or visit our websites trinitychannel.com and abnsat.com. Or for more information, call us at one of the numbers on your screen.
ABN and Trinity Channel would like to invite you to 2 special live debates, Shabir Ali versus David Wood. The first debate will be on Monday, September 28th, 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 7 p.m. Greenwich, and 4 a.m. Australian Time. The topic will be,
was Jesus the Son of God or only the prophet of God?
The second debate will be on Tuesday, September 29th at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 7 p.m. Greenwich, and 4 a.m. Australian Time. The topic will be, Paul or Muhammad, who gives us the truth about Jesus? Watch us live on ABN and Trinity Channel, or visit our website at trinitychannel.com or abnsat.com. For more information, call the numbers at your screen.
Hi, I'm Don Deal. I'm the Director of Research and Development for Norm Geisler International Ministries. I'm here at ABNSAT's Trinity Channel to let you know of a wonderful new opportunity to join in on an ever-expanding, ever more influential ministry, the ABNSAT's Trinity Channel. ABNSAT is now expanding via the Hotbird satellite to areas to include Europe, Middle East, North Africa. These are areas that desperately need to hear the gospel, desperately need to hear the truth about Islam, about other religions. They need to see the comparisons between a true and accurate comparison between Christianity and the other religions, and Christianity and secularism. You know, there's so much information out there, and so much of it is so bad, so poorly researched. At the Trinity Channel, it's the one place where you can find the truth, where you're not going to get spin on how beautiful all religions are and how all religions lead to the same place. You're not going to hear that. At Trinity Channel, you're going to hear the truth, and you can hear it spoken by world-class speakers from around the whole planet, experts on topics such as science, evolution, Big Bang cosmology, creation, Islam, the cults, traditional Christianity, the history of religions. You're not going to hear that other places. There's no other channel you can hear this sort of information. This is desperately needed, good information, true information that you're not going to get elsewhere. I'm here to ask you to prayerfully consider supporting this ministry. You know, whenever it comes time to support, there's always 3 steps that I recommend to start with. Prayer, prayer, and then prayer. Pray for this ministry. Pray for the host. Pray for the technicians. Pray for the whole network. Pray that God's Word will reach the world, that the gospel will reach parts of the world that have never heard it clearly explained or defended before. This network is dedicated to providing good apologetic training to help spread the gospel. We're here to ask you not only to pray, but to consider financially supporting this ministry, whether it be a one-time gift, a weekly, monthly, an estate gift, whatever it is. We're here today to ask you to prayerfully consider giving and supporting this very important, this vital ministry. The original scholars of the church were called the apologists, and this network has recognized that we're no longer in a Christian nation or a Christian world. We've moved past that. We're in a post-Christian world where so many of the assumptions of Christianity are challenged on a daily basis, where Christians are ridiculed and mocked in the press and by politicians. We're asking you to consider supporting this ministry so that the truth can get out and reach the parts of the world where they've never heard the truth, they've never heard any other religion ever criticized or examined. Please consider giving to this ministry. Thank you, and may God bless you.
And we're back. This is the 4th International Apologetics Marathon here on the Trinity Channel. Again, I'm Mike Buratovich from Spring Arbor University. I'm here with Ed Rivet, the Legislative Director for Michigan Right to Life. You know, before the break, Ed, we were talking about the physical consequences of an abortion. Are there psychological outcomes that women have because of abortion?
Well, there are very serious psychological and emotional complications. In fact, so much so that it's known as post-abortion syndrome. There are everything from nightmares, all sorts of guilt, anxiety, drug use increases after abortion among many women, risk of suicide increases for many women after abortion, their ability to have another relationship, many times an abortion, even though they claim that the abortion is going to help maintain a relationship because the pregnancy was unintended. Very often the abortion breaks up the relationship. If they oftentimes have difficulty in pursuing their education, if they're in school, they lose their jobs. They have all kinds of social and psychological complications. Some women even, because they recall hearing that suction machine, and we talked about the first trimester abortion, they hear a vacuum cleaner, and it brings back the abortion, the trauma of the abortion, because they hear that suction sound. So they can be very profound psychological impacts, for sure, because of abortion.
And these are not experienced by women who have a miscarriage? At the same
No, generally not. There's a very much a distinction, and that goes back to the idea that with a miscarriage, even though they suffer oftentimes grief and sadness, they were very excited about a pregnancy, they lose that pregnancy from some natural cause. And so they still have to work through the grief. It is different than the fact that they made the decision to have an abortion. They were the force that caused the death of that child, and so as they recognize it, and that brings it in at a level of responsibility that has that. And so another common effect is what we call the anniversary effect. So either on the anniversary of the day of the abortion, it comes back to them and the trauma, or more commonly, they know the due date of that child that they aborted, what day that child would be born. So when that day comes around, the anniversary of the child's birth is missing, that birthday is missing. They look around and see children that would be the same age as the child they were born, and that brings forward another series of what ifs and traumas to them emotionally and psychologically, because they think, I would have a daughter or a son that age. And it's very, very traumatic. And so the idea that the abortion makes her problem go away is many times just a myth. And they experience the reality of that abortion for many, many years after.
And yet, if there's a woman out there who's had an abortion and feels that way, there is forgiveness in the Lord Jesus Christ. Absolutely.
And there are many ministries, post-abortion ministries, dedicated. Most often those ministries are run by women who've had abortions themselves. They have been there, they understand, they've been through the healing, they've been through the grace and the redemption. And so the most important thing for a woman who is suffering those consequences from an abortion is to reach out to those post-abortion ministries, because you will meet people who have been where you are, and they have the greatest sense of compassion, and they can bring them out of that pain, out of that darkness, to a place of healing and restoration. And they're going to be embraced by people like me and others in the movement. I have hundreds of friends who are women who've had abortions in the past, and we together have walked many roads of healing and recovery.
What about this? I've read this in the paper and in some articles too about this breast cancer connection between women who've had abortions and so on and so forth.
Yeah, this is really an important one, because breast cancer, the rate of breast cancer has increased so dramatically in the Western world, and certainly in the United States over the last 4 or 5 decades. And it's not accidental that it parallels the legalization of abortion, because we talked about how often those abortions, 90% of them are in the first trimester very early. And what we understand about the physiology of women's bodies and the preparation of the breast to breastfeed. The breast goes through a transformation process throughout the pregnancy. And what happens when they abort the pregnancy, they abort the development of the woman's cells in her breast. They're trying to be prepared to nurse the child and to produce milk for the child. That's nature. When you abort the pregnancy, you abort the development, and you leave cells halfway developed, and those become more vulnerable to turning into breast cancer cells. So it increases a woman's risk to breast cancer by cutting off that development process early in the pregnancy. And the medical community wants to deny that reality, but there are dozens upon dozens of studies that show an increased risk of breast cancer when women abort pregnancies early on, especially their first pregnancy, because those cells are going through that development for the first time, and that increases their risk of breast cancer.
Is this also the case internationally, not just in the United States?
Oh, absolutely. Studies, countries as diverse as Japan, China, Russia, the same phenomena has been documented in the medical research all across the globe.
Wow. In the United States, it seems to me when we discuss the abortion issue on college campuses, usually it's framed something like this. It's a woman making a choice about what happens to her own body. Would you say that's the core of the abortion debate?
Well, that's the core that people would like to keep the discussion on. They don't want to talk about the unborn child. They don't want to talk about the risk to women. They don't want to talk about the complications. They don't want to talk about how brutal abortion is. They want to focus it around the idea that this is a woman making decisions about her body and the autonomy of it. But there's another element to that I want to point out, Michael, that's it's a very dark side of abortion as well, and that is many women are coerced, compelled, pressured to have abortions, and it is really not their choice. And that's what makes it an even doubly oppressive thing. Already it kills the child. Already it does not respect the child's rights to life and the dignity of the child. But when women are pressured, and they happen every day that women are pressured to have abortions, then it also doesn't respect them and their dignity and their autonomy. They're having an abortion they don't want to have. And coerced abortions is a huge phenomenon that happen every day in the United States and in other countries because other people feel this is what's best for you. This is what's going to allow you to go on with your life. And so the pressure is there, and it is not even a free choice. And so when they try and phrase it as a woman's body and her choice, and many, many times, that's just a facade.
What are the economic impacts of abortion? Are there any economic impacts, at least we know of?
Well, you know, there are so many tangents of this issue. And the economic impact that people don't recognize is that not only do women have many complications, and so while they think, I'm going to have this abortion, it's going to be over with, they have all the causes, the complications that cost them substantially more than the abortion ever did. But economically, when we destroy families, we destroy the cultures. You know, Europe is going through a population implosion. Japan is losing population. When we don't accept our children, when we don't see them as a blessing, we don't have the workers. You're seeing a worker shortage in countries. You're seeing the social safety net is being undermined for senior citizens and for others because there are not enough people working. In the United States, we have the Social Security system. There's a concern it will go bust. In Japan, they only have 2 workers now for every retiree who is getting funds from the government. There's going to come a point where there will not be enough support financially for the elderly, for the disabled, because there are not enough people working, because we're seeing negative population growth. In Russia, in Germany, they actually have governmental programs trying to encourage people to have children because the economic impact on the economy as a whole, but also on government revenues, is becoming substantial. It's becoming a crisis situation.
Well, that leads to a follow-up question then. Does abortion affect different people groups differently?
Yes, it does dramatically, and for reasons you wouldn't necessarily expect or you wouldn't think of intuitively. Yes, we're seeing the impact of the culture as a whole. Not enough children, not enough workers. That affects the economy. So elderly people are being affected by abortion because there are not children coming through to support them. But then we can look at 2 other means. In some countries, abortion is utilized to affect certain populations, minority populations, people being pressured to have abortions because they're of a certain religious background, because they're a certain ethnic background. The governments might be promoting the abortion of people from those ethnic or religious groups. Then there are the children who are basically singled out, targeted for death because they're not perfect. The disabled, children that would have certain diseases or conditions, Down syndrome children, children born with spina bifida. If they can detect those things prenatally with tests, whether it's an ultrasound, whether it's a genetic screening test, they are practicing eugenics. They are practicing the very thing that Hitler, that Margaret Sanger talked about, these children that are not worthy of being born. And so they're being affected by abortion. They're being singled out, targeted for death, because some people feel that they don't deserve to be born and shouldn't be with us. And so, yeah, whether it's on racial issues, whether it's on disability issues, that certain people are being targeted for death instead of the chance to be born like you and me.
So abortion can be almost a means of social engineering.
It is, and absolutely, we'll talk about one of the most significant experiences across the globe is the one-child policy in China, where the government has basically said, you can have one child. If we find that you're pregnant after that, the government will come and look to forcibly cause that woman to have an abortion, drag them literally to the abortion clinics, even late into the pregnancy. And so it is a matter of governmental policy, of social engineering to say, we have too many children. We went through the 60s and 70s, the whole population was concerned that the world is becoming overpopulated, and so governments were actually putting pressure on people not to have children, and now we're suffering that consequence. But yes, social engineering is absolutely a tool of oppressive governments, and so you have millions of children being aborted in China and in countries like North Korea and elsewhere, and so the residual effect, who's being affected? Young men today can't find wives to marry because 20, 25, 30 years ago, the governments were pressuring more and more abortions. And so women were having abortions, especially of girls, if they could identify. In India, the whole idea of gender abortions. And in China, where boys are more coveted socially. So we talk about who's being affected. Women, unborn children, because their women are being aborted. So now you have an imbalance of males to females in these Asian countries. And so who's being affected by it? Young men don't have women to marry because abortion was being used in those cultures to abort unborn females. And so we have this imbalance. There's another group that is suffering the consequences of abortion. Both the girls not being born and their lives being taken, and young men now who don't have women to marry. So that leads to the whole human trafficking. They're going and kidnapping women in one Asian country and bringing them to another country where they don't have enough women to marry. And so they're literally stealing brides from one nation and bringing them to another.
It's my understanding that single men in China who can't find brides commit the majority of the crime.
They do. And unfortunately, I think we also see the consequences of suicide. When they feel hopeless, they feel trapped, they feel like they will never be able to have a son of their own, a child of their own, have a family of their own. And so those sorts of desperation things come in. And yes, they don't have that opportunity to create a relationship, to create a family, which is so natural and foundational to the human instinct. I want to be married, I want to be a father, I want to have a family. And the opportunities are taken from them because of abortion. And people don't see those ripple effects across the culture. But when you talk about millions upon millions of abortions in China, I mean, you're talking tens of millions of babies that were aborted, and that's having that ripple effect 5, 10, 25, 30 years later. And it's a significant impact on the culture.
What about the impact of abortion on the African American community here in the United States? That's been significant, hasn't it?
It has been dramatic. In fact, in the United States, nearly 50% of all the abortions are on women who are African American, and they are only about 14 to 16% of the population, depending on the state. So they're only half of the women of childbearing, or only 16% of the women of childbearing age, but they're having half of the abortions. And this gets to those people we talked about who promotes abortion. And there's a history of abortion, as you mentioned, being a tool of social engineering. There's a history of those who wanted to see African Americans curtailed, especially in the United States. Margaret Sanger being the most famous advocate of eugenic abortion, as she said, of sanitizing the population and limiting the births among African Americans, among immigrants who weren't educated according to her standards. She was very much one who wanted to see the black population suppressed. And so we see the abortion rate completely out of proportion in the United States when it comes to the African American community.
So is abortion then being used as a form of birth control?
Well, there are two ways in which it's being used. One is that social control, that social engineering, as we talked about in China. They wanted to control the population. They felt they were growing too fast, and so we need to use abortion as a tool. So they were limiting to single births and then using abortion as a tool. But the other form of birth control we don't realize is in the United States, especially, but perhaps in other countries, as I mentioned earlier, some women having 2, 3, 4, 5, 7 abortions. So they're not using preventative means, and in Russia, it was the #1 form of birth control is to have abortion after abortion. We saw that in communist Romania, Czechoslovakia before the fall of the Iron Curtain in the 1990s. abortion was essentially being paid for by the government as the primary means of birth control. Women having 10, 12, they just weren't using a preventative method. Abortion was considered birth control. So tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of abortions, because they weren't given access to a preventative form of birth control. Abortion was the form of birth control, and still is in Russia and China today, where they could use a preventative contraceptive mechanism. They simply use abortion as backup birth control. And in the United States, half of the abortions are repeat abortions. Half of the women having an abortion in the United States today have already had one or more, and so it becomes that fallback birth control method. When the birth control is not used or when it fails, they just go have an abortion.
Wow. There's been some controversy here in the United States about the practice of harvesting and selling organs and tissues taken from the bodies of aborted babies. What's that all about?
Well, it's something we've known about for decades in this country. What's come to light in the United States recently, these clandestine videos, these undercover videos, where they were posing as someone who would want to buy the tissues and the organs from aborted babies and provide the money to the abortion clinic. And the controversies that have evolved from it are that they are purposely altering the types of abortions they're doing so they can get the whole organs, they can get whole kidneys, whole livers, whole brain samples, hearts, as well as, so they're altering the procedure to get them. And then there's literally a price tag that an intact liver is worth so much money, that they're then processing and then selling to research universities. They're selling them to biotech companies. There's a whole industry, hundreds of millions of dollars being attached to taking the organs and tissues from aborted babies and providing them to researchers. So what I want to do is turn the table for just a minute and have you explain, because many of these companies that are coming in and buying the organs from abortion clinics are using them for various types of research. You're a professor of biochemistry. You know stem cell research. I think it'd be enlightening for our audience to hear you explain when they're taking what they call progenitor cells from the liver, when they're taking certain kinds of stem cells or neural cells, what they use those for and why there's a demand. In one of the videos, this procurement company said, well, we could use 50 more livers a week than we're getting. So they want 50 more aborted babies so that they can get their livers, the thalamus from. So I think it'd be enlightening for our audience. We're running short on time, but just explain what they do with them, what they do when they harvest those organs, and where do they go and who uses them?
They use them for two things. First of all, fetal tissues have very robust stem cell populations, and those stem cell populations grow very well in culture. So one of the hopes is to establish a fetal cell line that can then be used for therapeutic purposes. And there are clinical trials right now that are being, where some of these fetal cell lines that have been established are being tested for therapeutic purposes. The other use of this tissue is as a comparison. So let's say, for example, someone has a tumor. That tumor gets taken out. You want to know what's actually wrong with that tumor. What do you compare it to? Say it's a brain tumor. Oh, excuse me, can I borrow some brain tissue? It's better to use tissue that's already available. Cadaver tissue usually is not easy to get. Fetal tissue usually is easier to get. And so you compare the genetics of the brain tumor with the genetics of the fetal tissue. So it's used for comparison, as a control to compare something to. It's also used as a source of fetal stem cells. Let me say this, though, that if you look at publications and grant opportunities for fetal stem cells, it's small potatoes. The vast majority of publications and the vast majority of grants go to adult and to embryonic stem cell research. Fetal tissue, out of the, say, 10,000 grants that are given maybe per year, it's something on the order of maybe 20 grants. Not even per year, 20 grants over a span of several years. So it's pretty small market. And even when you look at fetal tissue, there's really only 3 states where you have repositories for fetal tissue. So this is frankly kind of a small market. Someone might say, however, look, these babies are dead. What's the big deal? What's the problem with supplying these companies for tissue? Doesn't it give some meaning to the death of these children? Why is that a problem?
Well, that's a really important point, because we mentioned earlier about the coercion that some women experience. They're pressured. Well, the other thing we have to recognize is for abortion clinics and abortion providers, they only make money if the woman has the abortion. And so if a woman is ambivalent and she's not sure she really wants to go through with it, one of the enticements that the abortion industry can use is to say, well, if you have this abortion, you could donate the tissue. They can take tissues and cells, and that will go to researchers, and that will help them research cures for terrible diseases like Alzheimer's disease. And so it's used as a seduction to convince a woman that while she's reluctant, while something instinctively she might say, I don't want to go through with this, they can provide that incentive to her for her to rationalize a decision that she might otherwise be reluctant to.
And that's
to go
illegal,
through.
Isn't it?
Well, it is, because there are people with that vested interest. Remember, there are dollars in a sense being exchanged here. They're there to make a profit by obtaining the cells and then selling them to the research communities that are out there, sometimes for tens of thousands of dollars for these samples of cell lines that they create. And so there's money to be made, and so they're there to convince that woman, and it's unethical to influence her decision so you can make money.
So it's illegal to sell fetal tissue for profit, but isn't it also illegal to alter the procedure in order to properly procure
It
this
is,
tissue?
and that was the very first thing that came out in the first video, was, well, we alter the procedure so we can make sure we get the tissues that are in demand. And so that goes against the medical standards, the medical ethics, puts women at greater risk. And so, yeah, there's another example of how they want to couch this as the woman's choice. But in the end, there are all kinds of counter pressures, people with motives to make money, that are coming in and affecting her so-called choice.
One last question. What about this idea that vaccines are being made off the backs of dead babies? What do you make of that?
Well, as you pointed out, the cells taken from aborted children can be made into cell lines, and then they can use those cell lines as a medium to create vaccines. And so people don't realize that if they take their child for a chickenpox vaccine or some other type of immunization, that those vaccines were developed in the laboratory using aborted cells as a culture. And so it even reverberates, abortion reverberates into so many sectors of our life. And so they don't recognize that there's an ethical implication, that in order to make that vaccine, they took tissues from an aborted child. And so we can ask for alternatives, because vaccines can be created by alternative means, and they don't need to use the aborted baby's body parts. So we can always find a positive alternative to abortion, whether it's the choice the woman makes or what happens with their bodies and how we develop life-saving treatments.
So let me get this straight. You're not advocating that we should not vaccinate our children?
Nope, vaccines can be effectively, safely used, but it is important for people to realize that if we don't address the abortion issue where it starts, it can have those kinds of effects. But certainly, we don't oppose people using vaccines.
Okay. There's also, I'm sure, a desire amongst biotech companies to make new cell lines, and that might be part of the rationale for them saying, we need this many more livers, we need this many more of this and that. I don't know if you're aware of this, but before the bones are established, the blood-making organ is actually the liver. And so the cells that will actually, the stem cells that make all the blood cells are actually in the liver. Ladies and gentlemen, we are out of time. This has been a very sobering discussion, but we thank you for joining us. And this is the 4th International Apologetics Marathon here on the Trinity Channel. Thank you so much for joining us. Good night.